Hi Ben, how are you, mate?
Good, good. Thanks for having me, Gordon.
Thanks so much for coming on, man. Thanks so much for coming on again, I might add, because this is the second time you and I have had a chat, isn't it? And the last time you came on and we spoke, I don't think I'd been doing this very long. I don't think I'd even started the podcast then. I think it was just on YouTube. And the reason we spoke before was Venezuela. We were talking about because there was a US coup attempt going on there. And I remember you came on and really opened my eyes to just how nefarious foreign policy was around the world from Western countries. Because I remember you were talking to me about how the Americans and Saudi Arabians had conspired to overproduce oil to drive the price down low to basically make Venezuela's oil, because we discovered that there was 297 billion barrels of oil underneath Venezuela's soil, and it was the largest oil reserves in the world. And because it was in tar sands and it cost more to extract, that meant that Venezuela's economy basically just fell through the toilet. And I remember sitting there thinking, that's a bit Orwellian, isn't it? There's millions of people there you're murdering. And you looked at me like, look at Bambi. He doesn't understand what's going on here. So, yeah, that's, I pretty soon discovered after that this goes on in pretty much every country in South America, and obviously in the Middle East and elsewhere as well. And the reason I wanted to bring you on and talk to you about, I wanted to bring you on and talk to you about the recent Nicaraguan elections, which I know you've reported a lot on, and basically anything that's going on in South America at the moment, because what we're being fed over here is rubbish. The UK have just imposed sanctions on 8 high-ranking Nicaraguan officials, and the quote is for rigged elections. That's why. And I know that I've listened to your coverage of the Nicaraguan elections, and I've listened very intently to the Convo Couch as well, who've done great work, and obviously you at the Grey Zone. Were the elections rigged, Ben? Tell me what you discovered.
No, it's absurd, and it's even more absurd coming from a country that really knows what it's like to rig elections, considering what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, if that's not election rigging, then what is? But of course, it's more of the same. We see that Washington, London, Brussels have this obsessive propaganda drive against any leftist government, especially in Latin America. So the US government, the Donald Trump administration, dubbed Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba to be the so-called troika of tyranny, or as some people say in Latin America, the troika of resistance.
Yeah.
These are 3 socialist governments that provide free universal health care and education and housing programs and jobs programs and so many social programs in a region that, yes, there are some left-wing forces coming back to power, but has been ravaged by decades of neoliberal policies, of mass privatizations, of austerity measures imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. This is a region where in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, many governments devalued their currencies, adopted the US dollar, went through massive structural adjustment programs imposed by the IMF and the World Bank, in which people lost their life savings. In Argentina and Ecuador and other countries, people lost their entire life savings. And it's been a very economically turbulent, chaotic region, because it's a region that until recently, I mean, many countries don't even really have sovereignty. The US government in the 1820s, 200 years ago, infamously declared the so-called Monroe Doctrine. This was US President James Monroe, and he was also Secretary of State as well. And what that did, what that said was that Latin America is basically the backyard of the United States. It belongs to the US. What's funny, actually, is that the Monroe Doctrine was originally justified where the US was telling Spain and Portugal, the Spanish and Portuguese empires, no more meddling in Latin America. We're going to protect Latin America, in scare quotes. Basically, it belongs to us. You should focus on other regions of the world. And then in 1898, the US fought a war with Spain, the Spanish-American War, in which the US gobbled up Spanish colonies, including Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba. So the point is that the US has this 200-year history of colonialism and imperialism in Latin America. And if we're talking about meddling in Nicaragua and Venezuela and other countries, I mean, it's not new. It goes back well over 100 years. But as for the elections, I mean, we see this again and again. If Washington and London and Brussels, if they like the neoliberal candidates who win the election, then they say it was a great, fair, free election. If they don't like the candidates, they say it was a rigged election. And it's not just for Nicaragua. In fact, on November 21st in Venezuela, there were also elections that the European Union monitored. The EU monitored the elections, co-sponsored the elections, and the State Department response was that they were flawed and that they weren't fair and that they were flawed, even that the election was rigged even before it began. So again, we see it's not just Nicaragua. This is a pattern where Washington refuses to recognize electoral results unless its right-wing puppets like Juan Guaido win. So really quickly, in terms of Nicaragua, just in brief, there's a few talking points that are said to try to discredit the elections that are absurd. One, the corporate media claims the opposition didn't participate. Blatant lie. There were 7 different options in one part of the country, the Caribbean coast, which has a different system. And then there were 6 options around the rest of the country. And of the 6 options on the national ballot, in my articles at the Gray Zone, I've published photos showing the ballot. There were 5 right-wing options, 5 different parties. And then one of the 6 options was the Socialist Sandinista Front Alliance, led by the Revolutionary Sandinista Front. Okay, so that's a blatant lie. There were 5 opposition options on the ballot. The other lie is that the government imprisoned the so-called pre-candidates or presidential hopefuls, which is absurd. 0 candidates were arrested. No candidates were arrested. Now, it's true that some right-wing opposition figures were arrested, but they were not candidates, and they were arrested because they plotted a violent coup attempt after taking millions of dollars from the US government to destabilize the country. This is a matter of public record. We have the document showing tens of millions of dollars going from CIA cutouts from the US government to the right-wing extremist Nicaraguan opposition, who then plotted a very violent coup attempt that failed, but it went on for months, and hundreds of Nicaraguans were killed. The country was destabilized. Cities were grounded to a halt because the coup plotters, they erected these large violent barricades and were torturing and killing Sandinistas. They tortured and killed even police. I mean, it was brutal. It was like a low-level civil war for several months, and they failed. And surprise, surprise, if you do that, if you take millions of dollars from a foreign government to organize a coup attempt, it doesn't matter what country you're in. That's illegal in every country on earth. And they face legal consequences. So because they were arrested, and by the way, some of them are in house arrest, including the multimillionaire elite right-wing oligarch who's funded by the US, Cristiana Chamorro. The US wanted to recognize her as Juan Guaido of Nicaragua. The US wanted to recognize her as so-called interim president, so they could say that the real government of the leftist president, Daniel Ortega, is not legitimate. Like in Venezuela, the exact strategy they used there, the US wanted to recognize her as so-called interim president, even though she wasn't elected. So that's why the US is so angry. But she was one of the key figures in orchestrating this coup attempt. She took millions of dollars from the US and laundered that money from a foundation into her personal bank account, which violated money laundering laws. So she was put under house arrest, but she's not even in prison. She's in her giant mansion that was paid for with US dollars. So the reality is that these talking points are absurd. And then the final talking point used to try to discredit the Nicaraguan election, which is blatantly ridiculous, is that supposedly electoral turnout was extremely low. There's no evidence of this. There's this small group, which is called Urnas Abiertas, which has no public people associated with it. Its website doesn't list any personnel. Its website doesn't list the history or what the organization is. It doesn't list any staff. It doesn't list who funds it. It doesn't even list where it's based. There's only 2 people who've been identified with this group, and they live in Costa Rica. They're not even in Nicaragua. And they claim that they had this big secret network of 1,400 like agents, secret agents who were secretly monitoring all of the elections. But the reality is that this group was created in April. Their Twitter account has 1,300 Twitter followers. So we're supposed to believe that they secretly organized this massive network of 1,400 people who like cryptically send a message to each other. And then also we're also supposed to believe at the same time that the government is supposedly a police state, and that this supposedly totalitarian police state wouldn't uncover this massive plot of 1,400 people. It's absolutely absurd, blatant propaganda, blatant fake news. And the reality is that the Independent Electoral Council in Nicaragua said that there was 65% voter turnout, which if you look at the past voter turnout in the past several elections, including past elections that were monitored by the European Union and the Organization of American States, the statistics in terms of voter turnout and the percentage that went to the Sandinista Front and the other opposition parties is very consistent in every single election. So it's absolutely preposterous. There's been a massive propaganda campaign trying to discredit the Nicaraguan elections. But if you go through every talking point, it just falls apart immediately. It crumbles with a little bit of scrutiny.
There's a lot to unpack there. First of all, you mentioned the IMF, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, this is the International Monetary Fund. Can you talk a bit about how the IMF was involved in destroying these countries? Because people, the way the media portray the IMF over here is that the IMF, they go in and they give these countries loans out of the goodness on their heart, and then they take a little bit of a percentage of any profit going forward. That's not the case, is it, Ben, at all?
No. For a first little economics point, not that I'm an economics expert, but something that you learn just from reading about a lot of this stuff. Look, if you are governing a country and you want to create a social program or an infrastructure project, you often need to run a deficit. This is, for instance, if you as a person want to buy a house, the vast majority of people need to take a loan or a car. You can't just buy it with cash, and then you can pay it off in the future, right? Imagine being the head of a government, running a country. It's even more difficult. Let's say you want to build hospitals, you want to build more roads, you want to create more electrical plants, all these things that the Sandinista government has done, the Venezuelan government has done. So frequently, in order to engage in these infrastructure projects and social programs, you have to take a loan and then you pay it off. And the idea is that your economy grows, the amount of wealth that the government has and the tax base increases. So yes, you have debt, but you can pay off that debt as your economy grows and you get more tax revenue. Well, it's very difficult to grow your economy without loans, without running a deficit. Very few governments are able to do that. So in order to do that, countries are forced to take loans from somewhere. And one of the institutions that does that is the International Monetary Fund, also the World Bank, which are sister organizations that are dominated by the US. The US has veto power over these institutions. The US created these institutions in the Bretton Woods Conference after World War II and made sure in the Bretton Woods Conference that not only would these institutions be dominated by the US, it's the only country in the world that has a veto power, but also that they would be based on US dollars, which would ensure that all loans are done in US dollars, all international transactions are done in US dollars, which means that countries that trap themselves in debt have to pay those dollars back to the US, and they can't print dollars. Only the US can print dollars, and the US does print dollars and gives that money to banks and corporations and the rich. So in Latin America, a lot of these countries, especially when they had neoliberal right-wing governments, they took these massive loans from the IMF. And a lot of times with the neoliberal governments, they didn't use those loans to actually build infrastructure in hospitals and schools. Instead, they used that money to enrich their friends and their family members. Just blatant corruption. That money went into the bank accounts of the elites. So what happens is that you accrue these massive debts, which really odious debt, meaning that the government can literally never pay it off. It's like the debt that Greece has. Greece has been trapped in this odious debt that it can never pay off. It's impossible to pay off according to basic mathematics. So, in fact, Yanis Varoufakis, the former economic minister of Greece referred to it as fairy economics, because it's literally, he would go in these meetings into these meetings with the European Commission and the European Central Bank, and they would force Greece to agree to these measures that were literally mathematically impossible. You can never pay it off. He called it fairy economics. So, and actually the German foreign minister also did the same thing, who was the one signing these agreements. So in Latin America, many of these countries were trapped in this debt they could never pay off. So in return, the IMF and the World Bank says, we're going to do structural adjustment. Now, that's a nice way of saying we're going to impose suffocating austerity measures. We're going to cut the minimum wage. We're going to cut Social Security. We're going to cut retirement. We're going to cut pensions. We're going to cut education spending. We're going to cut healthcare spending. We're going to just cut the safety net and make life harder and harder for working class people. And at the same time, we're actually going to privatize state assets. We're going to take control of ports. We're going to gobble up your country. And that has been a consistent policy going back decades, going back to the 1960s, 70s, and especially in the 80s and 90s with the rise of neoliberalism, Thatcherism, Reaganism, the collapse, the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc. And a lot of these countries, I mentioned Argentina, their currency completely collapsed. They devalued their currency. Ecuador, they're at a massive economic crisis. Ecuador adopted the US dollar as its official currency after this massive economic crisis overseen by a very corrupt economic minister named Guillermo Lasso, who was a banker, who is now the right-wing president of the country, this banker, this corrupt oligarch. So he adopted the US dollar as the official currency of Ecuador. If you go to an Ecuadorian restaurant, you pay for things in the US dollar. I mean, it's a sign of how many of these countries are semi-colonies. They can't control even their own economy because their entire economy is based on the US. They don't have a sovereign currency. The government can't print their currency because the currency is only printed by the US government. So we're talking about a form of semi-colonialism, just as in large parts of Africa. In parts of Africa, there is a frank economic bloc in which numerous countries in Northern and Western Africa, their currency is the French franc, and they actually can't, I mean, which is hilarious because France uses the EU, but France still has the franc as well. And there are these countries in Africa that can't control their own currencies, and that they actually have to keep half of their reserves in French banks, which means that France basically controls these African countries' wealth and controls their economies. And there's a very similar policy in the United States and Latin America. It's a kind of semi-colonialism. Yeah, and it's not just through military intervention and the brute force of the military, but also economics is the oldest form of imperialism.
Yeah, it's guaranteeing these countries that we're talking about have got, like, you know, their future is forever in serfdom, if you like. It's forever at the whims, at the wills of Washington and what they want. Now, when countries, when especially South American countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, when the people sort of rise up and there's movements in many of the countries, you know, there's this Bolivarian spirit in South America that really is quite inspiring, to be quite honest. It's people getting together and saying, no, we've had enough of this. Now, whenever that happens, there is a backlash, isn't there? And there are so many different ways that the West can backlash against. Like you say, there's economy is one, just the money side of things. Can we talk briefly about the social media side of things? Because obviously we're in the technological era now, and these are all sorts of new weapons that the West has got against these countries to try and keep them under the thumb. I know you had an instance where Mr. Nimmo from DFR Labs, well, I mean, do you want to explain that little story in Nicaragua for people?
Absolutely. So we've seen this again and again and again in countries that are the official enemies of the State Department, of the British Foreign Office, of Brussels. They're targeted with censorship, with banning their accounts, with preventing them from using social media outlets and Google. So the most blatant example of this is Iran. Press TV, which is a government public, funded TV outlet in Iran, their YouTube channel has been suspended like a dozen times. They've been blocked from using Gmail. They can't use Zoom. Like there's so many technology corporations ban them from using their platforms because of US sanctions and European sanctions. So Iran is a good example, but in Latin America as well, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, in multiple countries, Bolivia, social media outlets and big tech corporations are used as kind of weapons. We know that a lot of these big tech corporations, by the way, have contracts with the US government. For instance, Google is a longtime CIA contractor. It does cloud computing for the CIA. Google is also a longtime US military contractor. Google was involved in helping the US military map Iraq during the Iraq War. Google also is a major contractor for US police agencies, US police departments, and it helps them spy on protesters and run their surveillance technology. Google has actually helped create drones for the Pentagon. So Google is part and parcel of the deep state, of the US national security state, right? And it's not the only one. Facebook more and more has been merging with the US government. You mentioned a name, Ben Nimmo. Now, Ben Nimmo is the head of the so-called intelligence and security team at Facebook, which is neither intelligent nor secure. And Ben Nimmo, you would think, given his high-level rank at Facebook, that he has some kind of technical background. No, he's not some kind of technological expert. Ben Nimmo's resume is that the reason he was qualified to work at the top of Facebook is because he was previously a press officer for NATO, for the Western Military Alliance. That was his job qualification. Then he worked at a Pentagon contractor, a US military contractor, and then he went over to Facebook. And he also mentioned the DFR lab of the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is funded by the US government, Western governments in Western Europe. It's funded by NATO. The Atlantic Council is NATO's de facto think tank, and he's worked with the Atlantic Council. This guy is a NATO operative. He's a Western government-backed operative. He's not a technological expert. He was brought into Facebook in order to push Western foreign policy interests in Facebook. So he is responsible for censoring people in Russia, in China, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba, and now Eritrea and Ethiopia.
In the UK as well.
Sorry?
In the UK as well. He's responsible for censoring people over here.
During the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, he was a huge part of this. Ben Nimmo published these bogus reports claiming that Jeremy Corbyn was being supported by a Russian cyber operation, that the Kremlin was secretly trying to make Jeremy Corbyn prime minister. I mean, this ridiculous nonsense that was used to try to censor people, and including a British pensioner. They claimed that he was a Russian bot, and eventually he ended up going and he did some interviews in the Russian media.
I had him on the podcast.
The British media.
I did an interview with him. He's a great guy, lovely.
Exactly, yeah. There was also this Ukrainian concert pianist, I've forgotten her name, who's a very well-known famous musician, a very accomplished pianist to play classical music. And she's Ukrainian, but she's very much against the pro-Western Nazis that took over the country in a 2014 Western-backed coup in Ukraine. So she's accused of being so-called pro-Russian, as that's supposedly a crime. And Ben Nimmo claimed that she was a Russian bot. And Ben Nimmo wrote this report at Facebook and they banned her. But in reality, she's actually a very famous musician. So the reality is that this guy is a total fraud. But the reason that he's continued to work despite always being wrong in his reports is because he's advancing Western foreign policy interests. That's why he's there. And Ben Nimmo, 6 days actually, before the Nicaraguan election on November 7th, he published this ridiculous report at Facebook claiming that the Nicaraguan Sandinista government was running a big troll farm. And Facebook used this to justify doing a massive purge of over 1,000 Sandinista, that is leftist. The Sandinista movement is the revolutionary leftist movement in Nicaragua that had a revolution in 1979 against the US-backed right-wing dictator. So Facebook and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, they purged over 1,000 activists, journalists, media outlets, and other pro-Sandinista voices on the platform 6 days before the election, a week before the election. And then after they were banned, a lot of these people, I know these people in Nicaragua, many of them, and not obviously not all 1,000 plus who were suspended, but I know dozens of them who were suspended, who were purged and falsely dubbed bots and trolls. And after that, several of them went to Twitter, because at first they were not banned from Twitter. So they went to Twitter and they started posting videos saying, Facebook blocked me, suspended me, saying I'm a bot or a troll. I'm not, I'm a real person. Here's a video proving it. And then Twitter suspended them all as well. And then the next day, YouTube suspended over 80 pro-Sandinista YouTube channels. So we see a massive coordinated purge. This is election meddling. This is election meddling. Moreover, 3 days before the election, the US Congress passed new sanctions on Nicaragua, which was a clear threat, saying, if the Nicaraguan people, if you vote for the leftist Sandinista front, we're going to impose more sanctions on you. And they did. The Sandinista front won the election. So 2 days after the election, the US government, the White House, signed those new sanctions into law. So this is election meddling. It's infinitely larger than anything Russia was even accused of. You remember that in the US, there's this massive freak out. I mean, you kind of had something similar in the UK, but it was a whole new level in the UK, where these politicians in the US were claiming that Russia attacked the US, in scare quotes, in something that was worse than Pearl Harbor. And that the so-called evidence, after millions of dollars spent, after years of investigation, the so-called evidence the US government procured is that supposedly a Russian group called the Internet Research Agency bought like tens of thousands of dollars of Facebook ads. And by the way, over half of those ads were published after the 2016 US election.
And over
so
half,
fewer than half.
Over half were in deep red states that Trump was going to win anyway. So
yeah, what, 25, and also of the ads that were the less than half, the 40-something% of the ads that were published before the election, most of them didn't even mention Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And some of those ads included things like this ridiculous, hilarious meme of like Jesus consoling a masturbation addict, of how if you have trouble with masturbation, you should reach out to Jesus and we can beat it together. I mean, absurd. So the US claims that Russia supposedly publishing Facebook memes is an attack equivalent to Pearl Harbor. Then what the US does to Nicaragua or to Venezuela, where a few days before the election in Venezuela on the 21st of November, there was the same thing. There was a purge of Chavistas, including some of the most prominent left-wing media outlets. They were purged, they were suspended from social media.
It confuses me, this does, Ben, because what you're describing there is hybrid warfare. It's not just election meddling, because you've got sanctions, etc. And so, and Mr. Joe Biden, who described those Nicaraguan elections as, quote, a pantomime, which is like, well, I'm old enough to remember the last 2 elections in America at least. I mean, if you want an example of a pantomime, let's discuss that. But he says he came over to the UK and he made a speech and he says, I stand here before you as the first American president in a long time to not be at war. But here's hybrid warfare. You know, evidence, hybrid warfare, it is in your face here, election meddling, sanctions. Sanctions are an act of war. And you have got these outside influences that are simply trying a coup in another country. And it's as simple as that. So I find it very hypocritical that they point fingers elsewhere. But the other point I want to bring up, and I'm glad you brought up Russiagate.
Well, Gordon, one quick point, really briefly. The claim that the US is not at war is incredible propaganda, considering the US has 800 foreign military bases around the world and over half of the world's countries. But there's this neoconservative war hawk, just this diehard war hawk in the US named Max Boot, who loved the Iraq war and supported every single war. And he wrote this article in the New York Times after Biden gave that speech. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was in the Washington Post, not the New York Times. It was in the Washington Post. And he published this article here. And I want to read a line from this article, because Max Boot, this warmonger, was actually insulted by Biden's claim the US is not at war. And he was like, no, I love war, and we're still at war all around the world. And he wrote in his article in the Washington Post that, quote, even Biden's letter noted the presence of US troops on counterterrorism missions in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, East Africa, Lake Chad, the Sahel region of Africa, and the Philippines. So he's boasting that the US still has troops involved in all these operations. The US is still militarily occupying Syria. The US is still militarily occupying Iraq. And then, of course, what you mentioned, all of the hybrid war. So the idea that the US is not at war is absolutely ridiculous.
It would be laughable if it wasn't for the fact that people were dying all over the world as a result of it. And it's poor people. It's the poorest people in the world that these sanctions and whatever are affecting. You mentioned Russiagate there, and I'm glad you did, because I can tie this in nicely, because we found out recently, and through great reporting at the Grey Zone through Aaron Marte, who won an award for this reporting, that, I mean, I've been following Russiagate. I've got probably 50 videos, I don't know, something like that on my YouTube channel that I've done about it over the years. I was never convinced by it at all. And anybody, I think, who was paying any real attention and was being fair-minded just knew that it was rubbish. But what we found out with these two sources for the Steele dossier, the Steele dossier was where the whole Donald Trump PP tape allegedly came to view from it, was the two people who have recently been indicted by the FBI for lying were certainly the one main source and another source for that Steele dossier. Now, those two people were funded directly, almost, it's sort of indirectly, by the Clinton campaign. And then you've got the Steele dossier. Well, who was funding that? Well, that was being funded by Fusion DPS, who were being paid by Perkins Coie, who were being funded by the Clinton campaign. So you've got the Clinton campaign here literally creating their own fabricated story to paper over the fact that they lost to a cartoon character when possibly anybody else in the country could have beaten him, and also to paper over the fact that, we found out from WikiLeaks a few months before that the Democratic Party were all corrupt, that they were in league with the DNC, the DNC were in league with CNN and the corporate media channels, and they basically rigged their own primary against the socialist popular candidate, just like they do in other countries. It's so hypocritical, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's exactly what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, these countries deign to lecture the rest of the world on so-called democracy. Meanwhile, they rigged their own elections at home. You cannot say that the election with Jeremy Corbyn was free and fair. Neither of the two elections with him. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that they changed the number of votes, but the insane media disinformation. We know that British intelligence agencies were involved in an internal campaign against the leader of one of the major parties. I mean, that's the kind of election meddling that the CIA and the MI6 does around the world, but they were doing it in their own internal politics, trying to portray him as a Corbyn as a Russian agent, as a supporter of terrorists, as an anti-Semite, as all of this. I mean, this is election meddling. This is a very British coup, right? Like happening in real life. And an important point about Christopher Steele. So the Steele dossier is named after Christopher Steele. Who is Steele? He's a former MI6 agent who was involved in Russia operations. So it's just so perfect that at the end of the day, all of these spooks, all of these coup plotters, all of these spies, they always come back home, right? The kind of operations that Christopher Steele did in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, and in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, he used those same operations, came back home, and, well, I guess not home. He did that in the US. He was involved in this disinformation operation in the US. It's not a coincidence that not only was it the Clinton campaign that paid for all of this, and by the way, we've known that since the beginning.
Yeah.
Since the beginning of the Christopher Steele dossier, we've known that it was paid for by the Clinton campaign. But even aside from that, it was Oppo research, by the way. Mm-hmm. It was never firm intelligence. It was Oppo research.
Well, it started out, the Fusion GPS started out being paid by the Washington Examiner or something like that, which is a conservative outlet, and it started out as they wanted beef on Donald Trump because they didn't want him to get the nomination for the Republicans.
Yeah.
And then when he got the nomination for the Republicans, or it looked like he was going to win, because let's face it, he was up against Marco Rubio, for Christ's sake, you know, when it looked like that, then the Clinton campaign took over the funding of it. That's the way it happened, wasn't it?
That's absolutely right. And it also shows that a lot of these groups are just mercenaries. They'll go for whoever pays them the most. I mean, it's so cynical, but you hit the nail on the head. But the other point that I wanted to stress is that we also see the overlapping of these partisan political networks that are trying to get dirt on their political opponents, and spooks and spies from intelligence agencies. And we see that the venerable MI6, the venerable CIA that we're supposed to see as these great institutions that are incorruptible, the reality is that they're a bunch of mercenaries too, and that they are part and parcel of these operations, getting paid to dig up ridiculous fake claims like a P-tape claim. I mean, all this nonsense. I mean, there were very real things they could have dug up against Donald Trump. That guy and it has a lot of skeletons in his closet, but they went with this ridiculously stupid P-tape nonsense. It just shows how the overlapping network of the gossip industry and the Oppo research community and all these spies that are now retired. And I mean, it's this dirty world, and it shows how dishonest and corrupt all of these people are. And we're supposed to believe that the CIA and MI6 are like the most trustworthy institutions, and you can never denigrate their reputation. Meanwhile, they're soiling themselves on this kind of stuff.
They've got a history going back to the late 1940s of the CIA of lying about literally everything. Everything that they talk about is like every operation they talk about, they're lying. Even when they're telling the truth, there's still 10% lies in there. There's something you mentioned earlier that I dropped down. I wrote down that how Ortega had under house arrest. Did you say he put his opponent? He was under house arrest, and that's terrible, and that's why they had these sanctions. Well, hasn't the Ukrainian president put his opposition under house arrest as well? Yet he's got invited to Joe Biden's 110 country summit in December on, the new world democracy or whatever it's called. They're giant hypocrites, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the difference is that Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is obediently pushing a pro-Western line. He's serving their interests. So that's absolutely why they are willing to turn a blind eye, not only to him arresting his opponents, but shutting down tons of media outlets, even media outlets that were not even necessarily quote unquote pro-Russian, again, as if that's some kind of crime. But there was this English language Kiev-based media outlet that was seen as like an expat newspaper that was not pro-Russian, and even they were shut down. Any media outlet that's not just printing total full-on pro-Western, pro-NATO propaganda has been shut down in Ukraine, and not a peep of criticism. Meanwhile, let's keep in mind here, the European Union dubbed Janine Áñez the coup leader in Bolivia, who massacred dozens of pro-democracy indigenous protesters. They have dubbed her a political prisoner. They have been lobbying for her to be freed. In fact, they were going to give her this award called the Sakharov Prize or something that the EU has, which is named after some like former Soviet dissident. They were going to give her their biggest award for so-called political prisoners. Instead, they gave it to Navalny, of course. But the reality is that this woman organized a fascist military coup and was the unelected president for a year, in which she massacred protesters, locked up her opponents, shut down opposition parties. She was a literal dictator of a coup regime, and the European Union is calling her a political prisoner who should be released. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
No, you can't. And while they're elevating people like that, and you mentioned, the one outlet in Nicaragua that gave the suspicious polling data, they suddenly sprang up from April. I can imagine. I don't remember what you called it or whether you gave the name of it, but I can imagine it's something like the Nicaraguan Observatory for Election Integrity. It'll sound really wonderful. They do this all the time. Western outlets do. There's a place about 30 miles away from me in Coventry. It's a guy in a house. It's one guy in a house with a phone. He's an ex-Syrian
Rami
who was
Abdul Rahman.
exiled from Syria.
His name is Rami Abdul Rahman of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is funded by the British government.
It sounds wonderful, doesn't it? The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the Assad did this chemical weapons. No, well, no, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is a geezer in Coventry that Assad wanted to put in prison for a third time because of fraud. And he fled to the UK. He was given £196,000 loan for, quote, equipment by the UK government to set up the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And now every newspaper in the whole of the UK prints the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights as the gospel on deaths, on crimes in Syria. And this guy is clearly a partisan player here. He's clearly just, I mean, I'm not saying that he's not being honest or anything like that, but he doesn't know who's on the other end of the phone giving him this information. It's being fed to him, and you can see they're creating their own news here, and they're doing it in every country around the world, including this one and the US.
That's absolutely right. And this is exactly how the kind of chain of custody of so-called journalism works today, is that the sources used by so-called journalists are completely partisan organizations, usually funded by Western governments. So you mentioned the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, run by this guy, Rami Abdul Rahman, based in Coventry, England, from his house. He hasn't been inside Syria in over a decade. He left Syria before even the war began. He's an opposition supporter. He's an activist. He's not some kind of expert on death counts, and he's not even in the country. How are you supposed to know about the death count? But he's not the only example. The White Helmets are another good example.
Yeah.
The White Helmets are constantly cited as some kind of impartial source. It's never mentioned that they've received tens of millions of dollars from Western European governments and the US government. And there's so many other examples. You mentioned this case in Nicaragua, which is called Urnas Abiertas, this group, which means open polls. It's probably funded by Western governments, but we don't even know because they don't even list who their staff are on their website. They don't have any information about them. It's just a black box of it's a black hole. There's no information about this group. So the way this works is that similarly in Myanmar right now, there's this group based in Thailand. They're not even in Myanmar, of these exiles who were funded by Western governments, by the National Endowment for Democracy, to share information about so-called death tolls. I was just going
to start talking about the National Endowment for Democracy. So
yeah.
Please tell me more.
National Endowment for Democracy is this CIA cutout created by the US government in the 1980s by the Ronald Reagan administration. Its co-founder admitted that the NED does what the CIA used to do. The CIA, for instance, its first operation ever was in 1948, in which it handed out literally like cartoons. It handed out big bags of cash to right-wing political parties in Italy, to the Catholic Church, and to media outlets to spread fake news and lies and propaganda against the communists and the socialists, because they were extremely popular after World War II, because the communists led the resistance, the armed resistance against Italian fascism. So in fact, Mussolini himself was killed by a communist. Okay. It was not something like some right-wing Christian Democrat. It was the Communist Party. So after the war ended and the first election that happened in 1948, the US was afraid that the communists would win. So the CIA rigged the election, giving all this money out. So the NED does those kinds of operations, but the difference is that the CIA used to do that covertly. The NED does it openly. The NED gives millions of dollars to all of these opposition groups, media outlets, right-wing neoliberal groups, all of them, to destabilize leftist and independent anti-imperialist forces around the world. So this is media outlets often cite NED-funded, US government-funded groups as their so-called sources, and then they just regurgitate what those groups say as if they're impartial, and you can never challenge their statistics, their so-called facts, even though they're often, there's never any raw data presented. We're supposed to take at face value what these US government-funded partisan groups say, and it's regurgitated in the media and never challenged.
Yeah, and then when people like yourself do challenge these governments and challenge them, they will cite the very articles that they funded and that they've they'll cite that as evidence that we're doing the right thing. It's really incredible. There's another one. Is it the OAS? Is that another one that's a similar organization to the NED?
No, you're thinking of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is a little older than the NED, but it's the so-called aid arm of the U.S., but it's often used for CIA operations. So, for instance, USAID in the 1980s sent weapons to the Contras, the far-right death squads in Nicaragua that were massacring civilians and burning down schools and hospitals. And they sent these weapons on humanitarian aid flights, just as in 2019, USAID tried to use so-called humanitarian aid to launch a coup against Venezuela. If you remember, in February, there was this propaganda campaign where the US military and the Colombian military were trying to force over these big trucks of so-called humanitarian aid across the Venezuelan border, and the Venezuelan government refused to accept it. So then all the media propaganda was that the Maduro regime refuses to accept humanitarian aid. But even the United Nations and even the International Red Cross, even they spoke out and said, no, this is not aid. This is, I mean, it's so blatant. And you know who's running USAID right now? Samantha Power, the queen of humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect warmongering, an architect of the war in Libya and the war in Syria.
Yeah, I remember that. I covered that that thing on the border of Venezuela. There was a truck that was caught on fire, and CNN reported that it was blown up by somebody throwing a Molotov cocktail from the Venezuelan side. And now like, I think it was a Grey Zone that showed the footage, and it was like, no, look, it's the guys from this side who set fire to their own truck, so the media could report that the Venezuelans were setting fire to, quote, aid trucks on the border.
That's absolutely right. It was originally Marco Rubio started spreading these lies that it was clearly a coordinated fake news operation. Marco Rubio, the godfather of all of the like anti-Cuba extremists in Miami, he claimed on Twitter that the so-called Maduro regime, that is the elected government of Maduro, lit the so-called aid on fire because it refused to accept it. And then immediately that claim was regurgitated by the media, including the New York Times, by the way. Every major media outlet said the Venezuelan government lit the so-called aid on fire. And then, by the way, you mentioned the Grey Zone covered it. My colleague Max Blumenthal, we were in Venezuela at the time on the ground reporting, and my colleague Max published an article saying very clearly that there was video evidence, and he showed it all, that it was actually the US-backed Colombian extremist forces, including Colombian military forces on the ground, that they threw the Molotov cocktail, and they lit the so-called aid on fire. And we knew that the day of. My colleague Max Blumenthal published the article the day of, and a few months later, after it happened, several weeks after it happened, the New York Times admitted that it was lit on fire by the Colombians and not by Venezuela. Even though the New York Times falsely accused the Venezuelan government originally, and they never issued a correction, even though their own article contradicted what they previously said. It's
incredible what they're doing at the New York Times and Washington Post at the moment. I mean, they're scrambling at the moment to retract all sorts of stories that they've written about Russiagate, and the Washington Post even themselves are saying, listen, wide blocks of our reporting over the last 5 years really need to be looked at because of the mistakes that have been made, etc. But the thing is, many of those articles were amongst the 20 or so articles that a group of reporters got given Pulitzer Prizes for. This isn't just creating your own news, it's creating your own news and then giving yourself awards on the back of it. And meanwhile, people around the world are starving and hungry and facing sanctions, can't get medical supplies because of US sanctions. It's a total and utter, in my view, abdication of duties to the fourth estate from journalists around the world, that they are not pointing out the things that you guys at the Grey Zone are pointing out, Ben.
Yeah, Gordon, I couldn't agree anymore. I mean, you said it perfectly. The point of journalism is supposed to be holding powerful people to account. And instead, we see again and again that not just in the US, especially in the UK as well, we see that these mainstream corporate media outlets, they're just handmaidens for the powerful. They regurgitate what the government tells them. They, especially on international coverage, I mean, anything revolving around Russia, China, Iran, any of that. I mean, it might as well have been written by MI6 and CIA if it wasn't directly. But even for domestic coverage, I mean, the propaganda campaign against Corbyn, against Bernie Sanders, against anyone who challenges the oligarchy, the elites, it's just pure on fake news and propaganda. And the only thing I can be grateful for at the end of the day, the silver lining, is that we've always known, going back to the weapons of mass destruction lies and Gulf of Tonkin, we've always known that these media outlets have been mercenaries full of lies and fake news in the interest of Western governments. But more and more, it's become blatant, obvious to the entire world and impossible to deny. So at least they're no longer even pretending to be the kind of like great independent truth tellers. They used to at least try to maintain a degree of separation, but now you turn on MSNBC, or as people now call it, MSNBCIA, and half the time you turn it on, and there's a former in scare quotes, a former CIA agent, the former director of the CIA is constantly on there. The former director of the FBI is constantly on there, giving you so-called news.
Not only former directors of the FBI and CIA, and but former directors like James Clapper, who've lied openly to the Senate about mass surveillance, just openly. He should be facing prison time for that. Instead, he gets a massive contract on MSNBC. It's quite remarkable, that is. Ben, thanks so much for your time. I know you're extremely busy. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover in like the last few minutes?
No, I think we did a great job of covering a variety of issues. I would just say that anyone who wants to dig deeper into all of this, you can go to thegrayzone.com, and we are North Americans, so it's the Yankee spelling gray with an A, thegrayzone.com, and I have a bunch of articles on Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Yemen, Iran, Russiagate. We have everything, so definitely go check it out.
It's an excellent outlet. I, for one, have used it extensively in my research that I've done over the last few years, and I really appreciate all the work you do. Ben Norton, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks to you, Gordon. You always do great coverage. I love your videos, and keep up the good work.
Thanks very much, mate. I appreciate it.